Hello, I'd like to begin by saying hello to all the participants in this year's Saints and Sinners Literary Festival, and offer my thanks to Paul Willis and Tracy Cunningham for inviting me to participate. My name is Carlos Dews, and I'm the chair of the Department of English Language and Literature and director of the Institute for Creative Writing and Literary Translation at John Cabot University, an American university in Rome, Italy, from where I'm joining you all today. Most of my career has been dedicated to the life of Carson McCullers, whose birthday is today, the day we're recording this session for everyone, February 19th. She would be 104 years old today. I edited the 2-volume complete works of Carson McCullers for the Library of America and was the founding director of the Carson McCullers Center for Writers and Musicians at Columbus State University in Carson McCullers' hometown of Columbus, Georgia. I'm currently under contract with Houghton Mifflin to edit Carson McCullers' letters, hopefully to be published sometime in 2023. And I'm very happy today to have the opportunity to speak with Jenn Shapland about her book titled My Autobiography of Carson McCullers. Jenn will introduce herself and then we'll begin our conversation. Jenn?
Thanks so much, Carlos. I'm Jenn Shapland, and my first book, My Autobiography of Carson McCullers, came out last year and was a finalist for the National Book Award. I also have a PhD in English from the University of Texas at Austin, and I currently live in Santa Fe, where I work as an archivist for a visual artist. And I'm actually recording this today from the archive. So that's my background.
Well, something we do have in common, Jenn, is we both have the University of Texas in common. My undergraduate degree is from there, and you got your PhD in English there. We've probably tread the same hallways, just in different decades
Yes.
there at good old UT. So the University of Texas is certainly representing well today, or is represented well today. I'd like to begin by congratulating you for being a finalist for the National Book Award. When I read the book, I knew it was going to receive nice accolades, certainly worthy. And I'm always curious to hear how people hear that they are both nominees and then finalists for award. Can you tell us how you learned?
Yeah, I actually think I was here working, probably just like scanning photos or something like that. And I got a call from my editor at Tin House, Maisie Cochran. And I really was just in disbelief to hear that I was on the long list. That was just not something that I ever expected. And, you know, I wasn't even, at that point, I was really not even paying attention to social media. I didn't know they were going to be announced that day or anything like that. And so then I immediately called my partner and called my agent, and I was just like walking in circles around that table, like, I can't believe this is happening. And then I think for the finalist, I knew they were going to announce it. That happened in October. So I was probably like waiting that morning just to see, but more interested to see who got to be a finalist in the nonfiction category, again, assuming that I was not going to be one of them, I was trying to kind of bet like who would be the 5. So again, huge surprise.
Yeah. Well, when I was in the MFA program at the New School, every year they would host a reading of the finalists for the National Book Award. And I'm assuming they weren't able to do something like that this year, or were you able to participate in a reading among the finalists just by online?
Yeah, we did a finalist reading on Zoom. And I think everyone had something crazy, had like 2 minutes to read or something. It was incredibly fast because there's 25 different finalists. And then the actual award ceremonies also took place on Zoom, and it was supposed to be black tie Zoom, which was a challenge for everyone, I think.
Well, it really is a wonderful book, and I'm so happy to be able to speak to you about it tonight where I am anyway. In a review of your book that I recently completed for the interdisciplinary journal Biography, which is published at the University of Hawaii, and that will hopefully be appearing soon. It's been delayed a bit because of COVID. I wrote that your book is perhaps the most honest and subtle consideration to date of the life of Carson McCullers, and is the most important work published on McCullers since Virginia Spencer Carr's biography of McCullers in 1975. And in your book, you advocate accepting what you call the messiness of identity and biography, rather than trying, as many biographers and writers have in the past, to normalize or regularize this messiness into a heteronormative biographical narrative. Can you talk to me a bit about this messiness of identity, both for yourself and for McCullers, and perhaps how McCullers was helpful with your own struggle with your own messiness of identity?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the kind words in your review about my book. I really appreciate that. And it means so much coming from you, because I worked with your edited version of Carson McCullers' autobiography, her unfinished autobiography, Illumination and Night Glare, really extensively on this as I was writing this book. So I kind of felt like I was following in your footsteps a little bit. But the messiness, I think, is so important when thinking about queer biography in particular. But I think it's also probably useful to keep in mind in any kind of biography writing, anytime you're trying to even just understand the shape of someone's life. So for my part, at the time when I started writing this, which was really around the time I found a set of letters between Carson McCullers and Anne Marie Schwarzenbach in the archive where I was an intern at the Harry Ransom Center, I found these letters that were clearly letters between two women who had loved each other, and they really captivated me. But I think they captivated me especially because at that time I was sort of at the tail end of a 7-year closeted relationship with a woman that I'd met in college. And then I was also being pursued by a male professor in my department. So I was in my early to mid 20s. Like, it was a very messy time in my own life. That's kind of how I think of it. When I really didn't know what my next step was, just in terms of a career trajectory, but also in terms of my identity and, did I want to be with women? Did I want to be with men? Was I a lesbian? These were all kind of questions percolating and not even fully formed for me at the time when I started on this project. And so I think you see that reflected. I mean, when I think of any conversation I've had with a queer adult, their journey to like understanding and accepting their own identity is always a messy, and by messy, I think I mean not super linear, not super proceeding in an orderly fashion from like point A to point B. There are a lot of sort of missteps, or trying to figure things out, trying to go in a different direction, not wanting to accept who you are, trying to fit yourself into a more like heteronormative identity category along the way. And I really found that reflected in Carson's story, which while in the past it has kind of been framed as her series of marriages to Reeves and kind of their passionate and difficult love affair, there's a totally different way to read her life if you sort of allow for the messiness that is definitely part of it, where she's with Reeves, but then she's also pursuing someone else or with someone else, or it takes her a long time to sort of start to come to terms with what I understand to be her queer identity. And it's really not until kind of late in her life that she kind of fully starts to articulate and understand that. So yeah, the messiness, the back and forth, it's not linear. It doesn't fit this neat narrative arc necessarily. So that's, I think, what I was trying to say.
Yeah, I one of the brilliant things about the book is that you sort of challenge traditional biography in a really nice way, because you point out that we ourselves struggle with our own identity and very often can't even define for ourselves what category we might put ourselves in, and why on earth would a biographer think they have the ability to discern that at a distance about somebody else from the material that's left behind by their life. And that problematizing, for lack of a better word, or that stirring up the very fundamental issues about what biographers are up to, especially in dealing with sexual and gender identity with the writers they consider. I think it's one of the nicest things about the book is that it's going to force, I think, people who work in biographical studies to have to stop and really think about that. And by using your own example, it's really powerful that way, because it really is, once you think about it and once you've brought it up, it's strange that we would think there's some kind of stability that we should be able to find with the identity of a biographical subject when we can't even do it with ourselves most of the time. So
Right.
I really like that. I think you're going to change the direction of a lot of conversations regarding biographical studies. I've been teaching a lot of McCullers the past few years to undergraduate students here in Italy. And something that seems to be newer of concern to students that seems to come up to the surface very often in discussing her is the idea of empathy, and how there seems to be this project that McCullers either explicitly or unconsciously was accomplishing with her work, trying to engender empathy in her readers and empathy for her characters. And you emphasize in your book the importance of understanding this message of empathy in McCullers' work. And if I can quote you a couple of times, you wrote, "I see the only story she ever wrote. A lonely misfit wrestles with her hidden self, unable to articulate her own longings." And then you continue elsewhere. "When I read Carson's fiction, it is clear that empathy is a choice a person makes moment to moment in how they approach other people on and off the page." Can you talk to us a bit more about your idea of empathy in McCullers' work and life?
Yeah, I think in her fiction, there's often we often get characters who are of different races. We get characters who are of different levels of ability, different styles of ability, and or gender or sexuality. Like all of those things appear in her novels and in her stories. And I think that one of the amazing things she does, and one of the reasons why I find her work empathic, is she gives you kind of a range of different characters to respond to this situation of difference, whether it's difference of race or difference of gender, whatever it is. And each character's response kind of speaks volumes, right, about where that person is coming from and kind of what their background might be. So she often has characters who articulate racist or white supremacist views that I think are, things that were reflected in Carson's own community growing up in the South, things that she was very familiar with. So I think she writes about that in a really very pointed and critical, but also honest way. So what I see as the empathy at work there is that she's giving you a perspective. She's giving you kind of the voice, the character of this like maybe white supremacist judge or whatever. And then she's also showing you kind of the interior life of the person who's being judged, right? Who's being seen as different. And then she's also always giving you another narrative perspective that understands and empathizes with that person. So I think she's kind of creating the situations where not only is the reader given the opportunity to see a person who's like kind of the outsider in a situation and empathize with them, we also have to empathize with the racist person on the page, or we have to empathize with the person who's being bigoted or homophobic, which happens in a couple of her novels. And we have to be inside of both of those perspectives, which means that she had to embody them and understand them and try to empathize with them to write about them. And I think that's really amazing. I think it's kind of an amazing way to write about difference, and to write about some of the social conflicts that we are obviously still in the middle of living through in the United States, not just in the South. But she's kind of giving voice to those different perspectives through her fiction. And then you see that play out in her life too, right? Like the story that people bring up the most often is that when the Columbus Public Library asked for her papers, she said that she would give them her papers if the library desegregated, and they wouldn't. So she didn't give them her papers, which shows you just like how you can kind of live those values, right? And how that can speak decades on. We can see her sort of anti-racist action in just in that one sort of refusal.
Do you know, did you see the piece that was published in the New Yorker a few years ago by Sarah Schulman called White Writer? Because, she argues in that piece, I think quite convincingly of the relevance of McCullers to our current times, and how she says that The Heart as a Lonely Hunter in particular is sort of a primer for intersectionality, that it really does provide a sort of textbook example, not only when you consider McCullers having written it, but the empathy that's displayed, for and among the characters in that novel, coming from wildly different backgrounds and wildly different experiences of the world. I also am teaching George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo, and empathy is such an important consideration in looking at that book, and I'm seeing all kinds of connections. Not only because I see connections with McCullers practically everywhere I look, but because there's something about the empathy in The Heart as a Lonely Hunter and the empathy that he's trying to engender or trying to display in Lincoln in the Bardo that makes a really interesting connection between those two books, and they are really nice to sort of put in dialogue with one another. I have another question. You confront head on in the book, and I was so glad to see that you did this, what we might call the closeting impulse of previous biographers, friends, and family members of McCullers. It still carries on today. And you wrote, quote, "It was her retroactive closeting by peers and biographers that I found most disturbing. I took it personally. I began to feel unreal, deranged. If Carson was not a lesbian, if none of these women were lesbians, according to history, if indeed there hardly is a lesbian history, do I exist?" Can you tell us more about the damage that you think that's been done by this sort of closeting of lesbians in historical and biographical narratives?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that I noticed, not just in researching McCullers, but in researching other figures who kind of lived at the same time in the same period, was that relationships, especially relationships between women, were often described as friendships or companionships. They were given these sort of euphemisms, and in a way, there's like a nod, right? Like there's kind of something you can read in between the lines there to understand, okay, this was probably a romantic relationship or a sexual relationship, but they're just not saying it. They're not comfortable saying it in this article or biography. But that kind of euphemizing, that sort of using language that doesn't quite accurately portray the relationship or accurately portray the person's identity, has this effect on present day readers of kind of just totally erasing that history, right? It is then possible for someone to read a biography of Carson McCullers and just not really understand some of that subtext, or to read a biography of like Jane Bowles, for example, and not really understand what it is that they are missing. And when we do that, then we end up having no real lesbian history, right? Like no history of queer women, no women who appear in these narratives who we can, if a person is, say they're an adolescent and they're reading Carson McCullers for the first time and they're like, oh, I really resonate with this character Frankie, or I really can see myself in this book. And then they, try to find out about Carson McCullers, they might come up against this kind of straight narrative and never really understand, oh, that she was actually kind of living this queer life. If they were to understand that, right, if that were right out in front with the right words, then it would be possible to say like, oh, that's so interesting. This was a queer author, and that might even offer a form of connection for the reader. So I think that we lose a lot of that possibility for seeing our own experience reflected, and for kind of being able to identify with figures from the past, at the same time that it creates this sense of there being no queer history, there never having been lesbians in the past, right? Yeah. Which is also really a struggle, I think, that many queer people come up against.
I mean, and at the risk of embarrassing you, Jenn, I think this is one of the most amazing things about your book, is that, especially the success that it's found, because that toothpaste can never be put back in that tube for McCullers now, thanks to your book. That really, you have set the record not straight in a lovely way, and that your work, and as sort of honest and direct and not to mention well-researched and supported by historical and biographical and archival materials, will make it impossible for that young queer person who's identifying with Carson not to be able to find the message that says, yes, the way you're responding to her is correct. Mm-hmm. And yes, she was like you. And yes, she does, sort of support your identity. That's the most sort of personal response I have to the book, because it's doing that work that I wish had existed when I first read McCullers and had the strong response I did, and was looking for confirmation that what I was seeing by querying her texts was in fact true, and it didn't exist at the time. Mm-hmm. And that's something that previous biographers and people who considered McCullers' sexuality were never willing to do as forcefully and strongly and honestly and directly as you are. So those, I think of these sort of queer adolescents who might encounter her work, all they need to do now, and it's great that her name is in the title of your book as well, because they will find your book very easily if they start looking for confirmation that what they're seeing in the text and in McCullers' life is in fact reflecting them. So
I hope that there could be more kind of revisitings of other people, other histories. I would just love to see more of this work done. And what I learned in the process of doing this research just on Carson and her kind of circle of friends in the 20th century is that there are a ton of people that need this kind of recovery work. And if we were to have that, then we would have this whole like much broader queer canon. Or kind of queer culture that we could really understand in those terms without having to kind of constantly prove the terms that we want to use to approach it.
Can you give us the names of a couple or three other writers that you think are ripe for this kind of consideration? I think of Willa Cather, but can you think of any others?
Oh, I mean, I recently read the book Rebecca for the first time by Daphne du Maurier. A quick perusal of her Wikipedia page will show you that there was, a marriage, and then there was a long friendship with the woman, and immediately I'm just like, I believe there's a much, deeper story here. There's a slippery slope. Like I start to see it everywhere. I start to question kind of a lot of the received narratives. But yeah, Will Cather is a great example, and Virginia Woolf, and they're both writers whose kind of estates. I was recently talking with a scholar who's working on a dissertation about women writers' estates and how they try to control their legacy. And those are two of the writers she's working on. In part because the estate has kind of clamped down on the narrative in both cases to make it difficult for scholars and writers to sort of bust through the euphemisms and start talking about their lives in a more accurate way.
Yeah, I want to talk about place for a minute, because it's, I think it's been important for you in particular in writing in this book, but it was always, of course, important for McCullers herself. You begin the story of your autobiography in Austin, Texas, where you were working in the archives at the Ransom Center, where McCullers' largest collection is held. And then you spent some time in Carson's childhood home in Columbus, Georgia, a place where I also lived for a year, quite a few years ago now. And then also at Yaddo, the artist colony in Saratoga Springs, which was very, very important to her as a writer as well. Can you tell me how these places were important for you and how they ultimately figure into the book, and what it felt like to inhabit these spaces, that Carson had inhabited, and how that affected you writing the book?
Sure. When I was at the Ransom Center, and I found those letters, I went on to catalog the personal effects collection of a number of different writers, and one of them was Carson McCullers, and so I was cataloging her coats and her nightgowns and her knickknacks, all different objects. I started to realize that by spending time with the objects and really examining them and thinking about them, trying to understand their histories, how they came to be in the archive, that I was getting a different access point to Carson's life, into her identity that wasn't sort of showing up in the written narratives that I had found. And so that kind of gave me this idea that if I were to try to visit the places where she lived or kind of inhabit those spaces that might help me think about her story in a different way, or it might give me access to some part of it that I wasn't able to kind of get my hands on. So that's the point where I applied to do the residency at the McCullers Center at Carson's childhood home, which is also kind of a museum to McCullers. And while I was there, I mean, not only did I have the chance to inhabit her space and to inhabit her neighborhood and get to know Columbus, which was super significant. And I really saw a lot of sort of similarities between the small southern city that it is today, the small towns that she was writing about in her fiction, and then my own upbringing in a suburb of Chicago. So that was kind of a weird and surprising connection that I made between the place where I grew up, which was a suburb, but it was also very much a place where I felt like I faced a lot of scrutiny, where there was like a lot of gossip, a lot of people really sort of paying attention to what everyone else was doing in a way that, you know, Carson describes in her books. So I kind of had that connection that I felt in Columbus to the place where I grew up. I think place always gives me an access point to feeling or affect. So being in Columbus was able to kind of put me back in touch with some of those feelings of kind of growing up feeling different in a community like that. But staying in the house also gave me a chance to visit the archives at Columbus State and have access to the Mary Mercer papers, where I found Carson's therapy transcripts with Dr. Mary Mercer, their letters. And so all of these different materials, archival materials, also just expanded the story, shifted the story, changed the story as I was in the middle of just trying to understand the shape of Carson's life. And then Yaddo, I mean, I know it was such an important place for Carson as a writer, and a place where she sort of came into her own, just as a young writer and as sort of a young queer woman within the community of queer artists that she found there. But I found it just equally a really transformative place to spend time and to do my own work. And while I was there, I was researching in the New York Public Library archives, where Yaddo's archives are located. So I was, you know, continuing to delve into this history, but also coming up against some of my frustration with the narrative and frustration with the archive, not finding the connections that I really felt to be there, not finding, you know, the evidence that I felt I needed. And so a lot of that was happening while I was at Yaddo. And I was sort of trying to write my way through these moments of absence or silence or contradiction in the story.
Yeah. Well, I want to get your take on something that, you know, I often think about, which is that many of us who dedicate, you know, a lot of time to McCullers' life and work very often have strong emotional responses to her and to her story, her struggles, and her work itself. Can you say why you think that might be, or at least explain what you think your personal response to her is? Because I can remember, because it also happened in Austin, Texas, interestingly, when I was an undergraduate at Austin, a friend asked me, who knew I was struggling with my own sexuality, sexual identity, and, you know, coming out and coming from this small town in Texas. A friend who was in fact from Boston, who was there at the University of Texas, asked me if I'd ever read this person, Carson McCullers. And I said, no, I don't know his work, because I'd never heard of Carson, and like so many people thought the name was of a man. And he gave me these Xerox pages, just sort of randomly chosen from, you know, various works by her. And you know, it's like Emily Dickinson says, when you know poetry when you read it, because it feels like the top of your head is blown off. And I felt that way when I read Carson's work, and I had never felt like someone had such a similar experience to me in relation to the South, in relation to a small town, in relation to, you know, their sexuality, feeling different, wanting to escape, all those kinds of things. So I've sort of worked on trying to explain my own personal response to her, but why do you think people tend to have this really strong response to Carson's work? that maybe you and I both have had?
Yeah, I wish I had a clear answer, and I don't know that I do. When I did a book tour last year, and I went to like 13 different cities, and I met people at every book event that I did who showed up just because they saw Carson's name, and they had loved her work at some point in their life. Maybe they were lifelong fans. Many of them read her as a teenager. I think she used to be taught more in high school than she is now. And they always remembered it, and they just sort of treasured her work. And so I think, for some people, maybe it's a similar story that you were just telling, where, it's just a matter of identity, of seeing what it's like to be an outsider, kind of expressed on the page, the interiority of that, the loneliness, the isolation. She captures those feelings in each of her books, kind of from a different perspective, I think. So that's what really, I think, resonated with me, and seems like it resonated with a lot of the people that I talked to, but I don't feel like I have a much more specific answer, other than that her fiction is so good. I mean, I think that emotionally, right, like psychologically, it is so astute. And I found that it was funny to read her therapy transcripts and find that in terms of analyzing kind of her own psychology and her own decisions in her own life, she was like not so astute, right? Just like we all are. She was unable to see things that were kind of like right there in front of her. But when she's writing about her characters, I just feel like you're getting these very realistic interior portraits that are so moving. But was it, for you, was it kind of getting those photocopies of Carson's work and reading it at that kind of formative moment? Was that what made you want to work on the autobiography?
Well, I was a music major. I was a music performance major as an undergrad at the University of Texas, and it was sort of a personal response. I wasn't thinking of it intellectually even at the time. I just immediately wanted to read everything I could get my hands on. That's when I read Virginia Spencer Carr's biography of McCullers, along with reading all McCullers' work. And then within a few years, I had to give up music because of a medical problem, and had to give up playing the instrument I had studied. And my fallback immediately was literature and psychology, because of this passion for McCullers that had been awakened by reading those pages when I was a music student. So it was just sort of always tucked away there as this other passion I had in addition to music. So, and of course, that's similar to Carson's story. Another similarity is that she was training to be a musician, and because of a medical problem, had to give it up and turned to writing. So it was yet another identification I could have with her, turning from my music studies to study her life and work. But the autobiography came many, many years later, when I was in graduate school. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Because to be honest, although I was living there in Austin, my undergraduate work, and had many friends who worked at the Ransom Center, I had no idea that McCullers' papers were there until I was in graduate school in Minnesota. So I had this missed opportunity as an undergrad to see all of her papers. I just didn't know they were there until I was in graduate school, many, many miles away from there.
Right.
There's a really important moment in your book when your frustration over this ridiculous sort of euphemistic language that's used, and the debates regarding McCullers' sexuality sort of come to a head for you. And I think it's around page 161. I think the chapter is called Preaching. And it's just a couple of pages. Could you read those couple of pages for us?
Sure, happy to. And yeah, for those who haven't read the book, the book is in very short chapters. There's like 80 really short chapters. So this is just one of those, and each one has a title. Preaching. So it isn't about, is Carson a lesbian, or Carson is a lesbian, or what is a lesbian? What I want to know is, how have lesbians gotten by and had relationships and found love and community? What does that look like? One answer, we don't really know. If we, writers, historians, biographers, can just start acknowledging the lesbian parts of ourselves and others, maybe we can start to know what it is to love women. But please, no more demands for certain kinds of proof. No more doesn't count unless bullshit. Don't tell me there's just not enough evidence. Let's call a lesbian a lesbian. Call yourself a lesbian if you've ever loved women. loved another woman, period. You loved your mother? Lesbian. It's all well and good for me to say this now. What if I've been doing all along, if not looking for proof? When I found what I was looking for, I had no clue what to do with it, what it meant. Queer histories often take the form of lists, of calling out and naming kindred spirits. This practice has largely gone out of vogue, as labeling a person's gender or sexual identity, past or present, is fraught with complexities. What did that person call themselves, and what did it mean at the time? Is it best to call a person queer or to specify? Is labeling always an essentializing force? As Maggie Nelson insists, the best way to find out how people feel about their gender or their sexuality, or anything else, really, is to listen to what they tell you and try to treat them accordingly without shellacking over their version of reality with yours. Perhaps in calling Carson queer, calling her a lesbian, I am shellacking, setting her on my own terms, despite my desire to give her space in her own words. By including her words, I make them my own. But there's a part of me, a defiant and somewhat juvenile part, that still wants the list. It's not all that important to me to define what it is to be a lesbian, constant shifting, the ever new, but I can't help but want to know who else is at the table with me, who I can call kin. And then after that, I do a list of Carson's possible girlfriends. It's just names that, because I was keeping this list as I was researching, I would just, jot down names. Just be like, okay, gotta look up this person. Gotta see what her deal was.
Well, I don't have the page in front of me open. Is Marty Mann on that list? Because that leads to a surprise question I have for you. Marty Mann.
I know Marty Mann was someone that Carson stayed with. And I think Marty Mann was one of the two women who was trying to help Reeves with his alcoholism at some point. I'm like vaguely remembering this.
Marty Mann was one of the, if not the first woman involved in Alcoholics Anonymous.
Right.
She later went on to, and her partner, many years, whose name is escaping me. I think her name was Priscilla something, was the editor at Vogue magazine. And I asked you that and wanted confirmation that she wasn't on the list because I'm editing Carson's letters at the moment. And one of those things that happens that, makes archival work and this kind of research so exciting and rewarding is that I get an email out of the blue about a year ago, I think it was, from a professor at Syracuse who asked me, he said, I've heard through the grapevine that you're editing Carson McCullers' letters for publication. And he says, and I wanted to see if you already knew about the brown paper envelope that's in the Marty Mann collection at Syracuse that has Carson's letters to her. And I think he used the word Carson's love letters to her. Mm-hmm. And they will certainly be included in the volume that I'm editing. I think there are 8 letters altogether that Carson wrote to her, and I only wish that you had those letters when you were writing this book, because I think you would have had a number of short chapters just related to Marty Mann in the book if you had seen these letters, because they're very similar to the strength of feeling and the sort of passion of Carson's one letter that we have to Anna Marie, but also Anna Marie Schwarzenbach's letters to Carson. They're of that level of significance, and I only wish you had them. And I can't wait to hear what you think when you do read them.
That's that's such a good find. And
it's a terrible team to tell you that without you having seen them, but
I know. But I remember that Marty and Priscilla were definitely friends of Carson's, that she spent time with both of them. I think that also later in her life.
That's right.
There's a more complicated history. That doesn't surprise me.
She sometimes stayed at their apartment in New York City, but they also had a house on Fire Island.
Right. Okay.
And she stayed there with them in Fire Island as well. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Now, this is going to be
good. It'll make you, not that you weren't going to look forward to seeing the volume of letters anyway, but it'll make you look forward to it even more, perhaps.
Definitely.
I'm often asked, and it's usually by people who are uncomfortable talking about sex, period, why it is important to understand about Carson's sexuality in the first place. I mean, I'm really often asked this question, why is it so important? If maybe you've been asked this question as well, and another way to look at it might be, how is a writer's reputation harmed by the tyranny of the closet, let's say. But why, if someone asks you that question, well, why is it important for us to even know what our sexuality is? What would you say?
I think what I would say is, why is it important for us to know anything about a writer or an artist? And, the answer to that is not because we need to use someone's biography or the facts of their life or their identity or their background to then explain things about their fiction, their work. But because by seeing the artist in this kind of like fuller picture, we can kind of understand where they were coming from, right? We can understand the perspective that they're writing from. We can understand some of the things that aren't totally said in the pages of fiction. We can start to kind of try to understand, emotionally, psychologically, where some of those things are coming from. But I also think that, just in terms of like representation again, right? The canon again, this idea of being able to see yourself in history, of being able to see yourself in the history of literature. I mean, that's really important for queer people at any point in time. So if we choose not to talk about someone's sexuality, what that usually means is we're choosing not to talk about their homosexuality. We're choosing not to talk about the fact that they were like not completely heterosexual or heteronormative. And so if we choose not to talk about sexuality, that means we're just choosing not to talk about this kind of whole portion of the population and their experiences. We're just sort of erasing it because, we've decided that it's okay to talk about sexuality in terms of straight relationships and marriage, but not in terms of anything else.
Yeah. And given how much time McCullers spends in her works talking about, for lack of a better term, love, it's sort of, you'd have to sort of shut yourself out from a huge portion of consideration of her work if you didn't then ask, well, what did this love mean for her? What was her experience of love herself? Because it may be one of the most prevalent words in her work is the word love.
Sure, and so then you're just choosing not to even try to understand the writer's subject. Like that was one of her big subjects, so we need to know.
That's right.
Right.
Well, I know you had, because you and I were in touch about it at the time, and I know you had some difficulty with McCullers' estate while you were working on your book regarding permissions and being able to quote. Can you tell us a bit about what was involved and how it ultimately ended up shaping the book? Because I think it did change the book somewhat, didn't it?
Definitely. So I requested permissions to quote from the therapy transcripts and from some of Carson's unpublished letters and other unpublished materials after, I had my publisher. That's usually the point at which you request permissions. What's difficult about that is that, you can be many years into the research and writing of something before actually obtaining permissions to use materials. So that was the stage that I was at. We'd already edited the book. We were going into copy edits and fact checking at that point. And I reached out to the estate to ask for permissions. I didn't hear anything for a few months. I eventually heard that they wanted to read the entire manuscript, so I sent it to them. And then again, a few months of silence and, trying to get back in touch, nothing, no answer. Finally, I got an email that just said, no, you don't have permission. There was nothing in that email that explained what it was I didn't have permission to quote or why. And I've since learned from talking to other writers, other scholars, that this is something that estates often will do when they don't want a project to go forward. They will just kind of issue a sort of blanket refusal without specifying what they actually have copyright control over, in the hopes that it will scare the person or the publisher enough not to go through with the project. But it didn't scare my editor, and it did scare me, but not enough. So I worked with my editor, Emma, and her dad, actually, who's a lawyer, to try to figure out, what did they actually have control over and what didn't they, what quotes could stay in the book and what quotes had to come out. And how could I paraphrase the quotations that I was using in a way that would be like legally acceptable. So basically I had to go back through and kind of cut all of these moments of that I thought were so important, where Carson's voice is coming through and she's describing her relationships or her sexuality or her feelings or her, something that happens in a letter, these details in her voice. And my project all along had been to sort of recuperate what was missing from this autobiography that she had tried to write, that she had kind of been dictating when she passed away. She seemed like she had this story that she wanted to tell in her own words, and she never fully got the chance to. So I had that in my mind, and now suddenly I was taking all of her words out and having to replace them with my own, which felt so wrong, right? Like it felt so against sort of the project of the book. But through doing that, I sort of started watching, and listening to any recordings I could find of her speaking. And just to understand a little bit, more how she used language and speech. I really studied those quotes that I extracted from the text. And then when I paraphrased them, I kind of started to feel like I was a translator. I was like translating Carson's language into my own to try to keep some of the things that are so amazing about her when she talks, like she's so funny, she's humorous, she's really candid and frank in this way that's kind of unnerving. And I wanted to be able to somehow communicate that and keep some of the cadence and the rhythm of her speech, but without having her words. And so ultimately, I think that process even brought me kind of closer to her voice, closer to understanding the things that she was trying to articulate, because suddenly I had to sort of re-articulate them. But it was also a frustrating process for sure. And it did really change the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I think someone who didn't know that you had to go through that and that you were purposefully having to avoid using her words, you'd never know it unless you knew the story while reading the book, because there's no sense of anything missing from the book. And I think that's a testament to the hard work you did from when you found out you couldn't quote until the book was published, because I know it was probably quite difficult, and it actually added some time to the publication process. How long? Was it a year, maybe?
A year and a half, maybe.
Yeah.
It came out later than it was supposed to, which was also hard. I don't know, with your first book, when you've been researching it for a long time, it's like, oh, I have to wait another year.
But it doesn't show. Really, it doesn't seem to. There doesn't seem to be anything missing from the book. That's a testament to the hard work you did during that year and a half. That it really, I don't think it's missing anything. I want to ask you, and forgive this sort of process question, we're on the verge of talking about it already. Could you say a bit about the writing process from when you first decided you were going to start writing the book till it was actually finished? How long did that take? These visits, how much time was in between them, between these visits to Carson's childhood home and both to Yaddo? What was the writing process like? And did it coincide, or was it after you finished your PhD at UT, or was it at the same time?
It was largely at the same time. So I was in grad school in 2012 when I found those letters, and then started, the cataloging work for the personal effects in 2013. And it was around that time that I completed my master's at UT and was going into my qualifying examinations for the PhD. And so at that time, I'm sort of doing the preliminary research in the archives and starting to write essays, some of them having to do with this, some of them separate, but all of them based in my work in the archives. So I'm at that point just like, starting to do writing that was totally separate from my scholarship. And I continue to do that. And I actually had some luck with an essay that won a prize at UT that had some money attached to it. And that suggested to me that maybe writing could be a viable alternative if I decided I didn't want to go on the academic job market. So I tried to figure out, in grad school, what can I do to sort of pursue both of these things at the same time, both this academic career and this writing, path, and thinking about this McCullers project. And I was able to use the money from that prize to go to Vermont Studio Center, which is a writing residency in Johnson, Vermont, where there's also visual artists. And that was like a hugely formative moment for me of, similar to what I described in the book for Carson being at Yaddo, like similar to that is just like that first time when you're surrounded by other writers and you realize, oh, this is something, these people exist, right? And this is another possible like quote unquote career path that I could take. So that was in 2015. So I'm kind of like researching writing starting 2012 on. And it was at Vermont Studio Center that I was like, I think this is a book and I'm going to keep working on it as a book. I finished my PhD in 2016. And so during that last semester of PhD work and finishing my dissertation, which was not about Carson McCullers, I stayed at the house in Columbus. I was on fellowship and I was able to I don't think that any of my advisors thought it was like a really good idea for me to go do research for another book, but I did it. And then I was at Yaddo much later in 2016 in October, November. And I finished the book in maybe 2017, or thought I had finished it. And then at that point, I sent it to some agents that I found just by reading the acknowledgments in other people's books. So, if there was a writer whose book I really liked, I would figure out who their agent was, emailed a bunch, and that was actually ultimately how I got my agent for the project as well. And then the publisher, Tin House, had published my essays in the past, and I just had a really good conversation with the editor there, Emma Komosrobsky, who immediately understood the project and was just totally sold on it and behind it. And I had talked to some other editors at larger publishing houses who had questions like, is this a biography or is this a memoir? And things like that. So
Yes.
Those conversations weren't quite going that well, but my conversation with Emma went so well. And I feel really lucky to have worked with her because, like I said, she helped me so much during the permission, issue with just figuring out what we could do and how we could go forward. So that was so lucky.
Well, Jenn, especially given where you're joining us, from where you're joining us today, I think you're the perfect person to speak of how important archival materials are in getting at the reality of the lived lives, especially regarding sexuality of writers, because it's in the archives where the truth is often found and not in the biographies. Can you tell us how important your early experience in the archives were with McCullers materials, and how having access to the archival materials and writing the book was essential, in particular the letters you mentioned, and also those 1958 therapy transcripts?
Yeah, I mean, if I hadn't found those letters from Anne Marie in the archive, none of this, I would never have gotten started on this path, I don't think. And so each chapter in the book, each piece that I was writing as I went along, I wanted it to be framed as almost an encounter with an archival object, or with a piece of this sort of like material history, whether it was, a piece of clothing or an object, a letter, a therapy transcript. And I wanted to kind of use those materials as a frame, but also to show how, well, as you were saying, how exciting archival research could be, right? So suddenly these letters can appear out of the blue that you didn't know existed, right? And that they can change the whole story in an instant. So I sort of wanted the book to track some of those discoveries, to show you, you could be sort of in the dark and then you can find something like the therapy transcripts that were sort of newly surfaced. They'd surfaced just a couple of years before at the archive after Mary Mercer's death. And reading those transcripts can just totally, change your whole perspective on the story that you're in the middle of trying to tell. So yeah, those archival resources were priceless for me as a way to engage with like a more accurate version of history, but then also just to understand some of the, the details, the smaller, sort of even more mundane components of a person's life that are not accessible in any other way. Like there was no other way for me to access the fact that Mary Mercer had saved like 50 different little cards that Carson had put in flowers and sent to her. I mean, in that case, it's the physicality, the number of them, and then the fact that they were saved. All of those things are hugely meaningful, but wouldn't exist, without the archive.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I told you, but I discovered, the manuscript of her autobiography, Illumination and Night Glare, also in the archives there at the Ransom Center, because Virginia Spencer Carr had mentioned it in her biography and said that Carson was at work on this autobiography at the time of her death, but she didn't talk about how substantial the manuscript was and how long it was, because to be honest, Virginia Spencer Carr had been prevented by McCullers estate from seeing those papers. So Virginia hadn't seen it. And so I was on a dissertation fellowship from the University of Minnesota working on my PhD dissertation, and went to the Ransom Center to look at the materials because I knew I wanted to work with archival materials for my dissertation, but didn't know exactly what. And this was back in the day before the internet and before everything was computerized. And they literally had the card files there in the reading room at the Ransom Center. And I had, the drawer that listed every item in the McCullers archive, and was flipping through this and got to the card for this Illumination and Night Glare manuscript, and it said 122 pages. And I thought, well, that's certainly more substantial than I got the impression from Virginia Spencer Carr's. And so Kathy Henderson, I don't know if you know Kathy, who was the head of archives division at the time, she was there helping me. She was sort of orienting me to the McCullers collection. And I asked her about this, and she said, well, no one's looked at this. She said, it's been there. It's been in the folder since the collection was cataloged, but no one's had this pulled. You'd be the first person to see it. Wow. And it was just this revelation to have, this folder delivered to me that included this manuscript of her autobiography. And I knew that day that, my dissertation was going to be about that autobiography. So it really is this sort of revelatory, almost sort of an epiphany when you encounter something in the archives that is of significance. It really just makes I don't know, it's almost a transcendent experience as opposed to reading about it in a biography, for example. And that's another thing that you captured, especially when you're talking about her personal effects when you were working with those in the archives. How, touching clothes that Carson McCullers had worn, and that you've seen photographs of her wearing, and that your job to, archive these for the future for other people to be able to access. It's really powerful work. And yet another reason that I loved your book, because I had been in those spaces that you're talking about.
Great, yeah, you were very familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have one final question, and forgive me because some writers are very sensitive about answering this kind of question. But for those of us who have fallen in love with your work and would like to read more that you have written, can you tell us if you're working on something at the moment and when we might expect to see it?
Sure. I have learned over the last year that it's best if I don't say too much, because if I start really trying to talk about it, we're all going to get lost. But okay. I'm working on an essay collection that's about New Mexico. And it's about sort of the culture of healing and wellness, but also the histories of toxicity in New Mexico. Right now, I'm interviewing a bunch of people about the history of uranium mining. So it's a very big departure, but there are still elements of memoir and sort of queer narrative in there when I talk about some of the queer history in New Mexico as well.
Well, for those of us who might be impatient, will any of them be appearing in any periodicals we might be able to see before a collection is finished?
Yes, one of them will. There's the title essay, Crystal Vortex. Is going to be in New England Review, I think in the fall.
Very good. Well, we'll look forward to that. Speaking of Willa Cather, back to her for 1 second. Do you know Death Comes for the Archbishop? Mm-hmm. Her novel. Okay, I am thinking about choosing it for this high school reading program based here in Italy, where we have thousands of high school students who read a novel, American novel every year in English, and I'm thinking about choosing it for next year's next year's selection.
Oh, I think that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really nice, and it captures the atmosphere very well.
Yeah, I think it really gives you a unique kind of glimpse into place, the Southwest, New Mexico. Yeah.
Well, I hope post-COVID, we can certainly have you come and visit us here in Rome. We can have an amazing meeting, and maybe have you come as a visiting writer or something at my university. It would be such a pleasure to have you. Yes. There's also coming up for any McCullers fans who might be at Saints and Sinners. There's going to be an international conference at a university in Budapest in about 2 years. And we'd love to have you come there as well. I'm one of the organizers of the conference. We've had to put it off. It was supposed to be this coming year, but we've put it off a couple of years to wait until we're clearly post-COVID to be able to host it. It'd be great if you could join us there as well. So we could have a conversation in person rather than via Zoom.
Yes, that would also be fantastic.
Right today. Jenn, thank you so much, not only for letting me speak with you tonight about your great book, but for having written the book in the first place. I mean, anybody who's passionate about McCullers is forever indebted to you for the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And obviously, thanks for all of your research on Carson, going back. And I'm so excited about the letters. So just, figure out when I can pre-order those.
It'll be a while still. I've still got a lot of editing to do.
I'm sure.
But I will send you a copy the minute they're done, because I want to hear what you have to say about them for sure.
Oh, good. Fabulous. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Jenn.